Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Giorlando. In today's video, we're going to take a deeper dive into the 2012 Nationals format and look at another one of the top decks, actually the deck that won the US Nationals, Windups. Now, Windups have gone through a lot of evolutions over the course of, let's say, the 2012 to 2013 period in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history. When the deck first broke onto the scene with a bunch of TCG exclusives like Windup Shark and Windup Rabbit, it was this combo control deck that could take multiple cards out of your hand with Windup Hunter and then grind you out through Factory and Rabbit interactions. After limitations to Windup Zenmatti at the end of the 2012 Nationals format, we started to see an evolution of the deck into a Shockmaster lock deck, utilizing Windup Magician and Windup Shark with only just one Zenmatti to pull off a pretty substantial board. Even as formats progressed and more limitations occurred to Windup Zenmatti, Windups were still one of the grind decks available. If you were willing to invest time into using Rabbit and Factory over many turns, you could generate card advantage and slowly whittle away your opponent's resources, and of course their life points. Well, today we're going to look at the summer of 2012, which means we're going to look at windups with no limitations. We're going to look at windups with 3 tour guides, 3 Zenmattis out of the extra deck, and of course the Windup Hunter loop. If you're not familiar with the Windup Hunter loop, after the deck profile, particularly after we talk about the main deck and side deck, I'm going to talk about some of the main combos this deck could do with just 2 cards, Tour Guide Shark and then Magician Shark. I've already took a deep dive into at least Dino Rabbit during this format, so I won't dwell too much about all the decks out there. I'll at least list them though, in case you haven't seen that video or it's been a while. We're talking about a format where Windups was absolutely a top deck, competing with Inzectors, which I'll profile in the near future, Dino Rabbit or Macro Rabbit, which I have already profiled, Chaos Dragons, which will be coming soon, Hero Beat, which will also be coming soon, Dark World, maybe to a lesser extent, I'll also happily profile that. And then actually of all decks, Final Countdown, I'm going to list as a deck I didn't previously mention when talking about the 2012 summer format. I'm profiling this deck under the impression that we're talking about the Nationals of 2012, which means at the US Nationals, the month prior, YCS Philadelphia, Tyler Tappan, who actually went on to win the US Nationals, ran a Final Countdown deck in top 32 YCS Philadelphia. As a result, Final Countdown was definitely on the radar of some players. We'll make some concessions in our side deck today to account for the possibility of running into Final Countdown, but those are really the big 7. Yeah, you could run into some other rogue decks here or there, but those are really the big 7 decks. So the deck that we're going to talk about today is going to be geared towards the 2012 National season and try to address those main matchups. I actually think it's really interesting to look back at this format and really credit Tyler and anyone else that ran windups at this event. I think personally, I went to the Dino Rabbit well one too many times. I had topped with Dino Rabbit multiple times leading up to this event, and I decided to register my trusty Rescue Rabbit yet again at this Nationals, and I didn't do very well. I went 1-2 drop. However, many players running windups realized that players like myself had been cutting back on hand traps maybe just a little bit too long. And as a result, windup players were really able to exploit, for example, my Rescue Rabbit deck that had no main deck hand traps and anyone else that was copying it to push through the windup loop early on, game 1, and then try to eke out a game 2 or 3. And I think a lot of players were able to utilize this really combo-centric deck and exploit that weakness in the format. Windups, over the course of the format, at least in the United States, had yet to really win anything. They were there, they were topping, they were always a deck in consideration, but they would always lose out at the very end. Well, it wasn't until the Nationals where windups really broke onto the scene, and I think Tyler and anyone else that ran windups really pinpointed the perfect time to build this deck. I remember old teammate Fraser Smith talking about how he had played a bunch of decks over the course of the format, but he was happy to have run windups at this particular Nationals because it really seemed like all the stars aligned. Enough people were cutting the hand traps, enough people were worrying about things like Chaos Dragons, which meant that you were cutting back on cards that worked well on windups like Maxi, and now windups could finally take their spot as one of the top decks and actually win and take home an event. But nevertheless, today we're going to talk about not any in particular windup deck. It's kind of a combination of a few players. I've elected to cut back on cards like Instant Fusion, which Tyler ran to win the US Nationals, because I don't really like Instant Fusion for a few different reasons. I think it cuts important cards out of the extra deck, so I'm cutting out Instant Fusion, putting in an extra trap or 2, and putting together what I think is a pretty typical windup deck. A lot of the decks at the European Nationals will resemble what you're about to look at today. Then, of course, we'll get into combos, side deck, and some of the strategies that this deck involves. But nevertheless, this is a windup deck, particularly a Windup Hunter loop deck from the summer of 2012. We'll start the deck profile with 3 copies of Windup Rabbit. This card was basically a staple in all windup decks. It was a TCG exclusive that added a very unique dynamic to this deck. It allowed you to generate card advantage with Windup Factory. That's one of its most obvious uses. But but it also enabled you to banish other windups besides itself, so it didn't necessarily just act as a strike ninja. You could, for example, banish a windup rat and make it so that on your following standby phase, a windup rat would return to the field. That was particularly useful with this deck because this deck oftentimes only had one normal summon, and then if you could stop the normal summon, you could often at least stop that individual push that turn, because in terms of extenders, you only really had one Reborn, maybe Call of Bahana, but that wasn't super popular, and occasionally people ran Instant Fusion, but that wasn't even necessarily always an extender. So because that was the case, if you could stop the normal summon, you could often buy yourself another turn. Well, if your opponent has a wind-up rat returning off of a wind-up rabbit the previous turn, you need to deal with that rat, and then you need to deal with the normal summon, and sometimes that can be really hard to do. So in terms of what wind-up rabbit did, generated card advantage, set up turns ahead. It also banished cards for some combos. You could banish a rat in the middle of a combo, overlay with another level 3 into Leviair, special summon back that same rat, use its effect on that turn. You also could dodge things like Torrential Tribute and Bottomless Trap Hole, very similar to how Strike Ninja works, but you could also do this on other monsters. So your opponent could, for example, Effect Veil or something, and you could use your Wind Up Rabbit to banish, let's say, an Exceed monster that has an effect that you'd like to resolve. So Wind Up Rabbit did just about everything that this deck wanted. Card advantage, it was a combo piece, set up future turns, and it was a grind engine. It really was a massive component of all the wind-up decks in the TCG during this time period, even after some of the limitations to cards like Zenmatti going forward. The next was another TCG exclusive. So this deck actually got two massive TCG exclusives that really put this deck into the top tier. That card is Wind Up Shark. When you combo one Wind Up Shark with either Tour Guide or Wind Up Magician, you can pull off the Wind Up Hunter hand loop that I'll show you in a little bit. In addition to enabling the hand loop, it also just was in and of itself a really important tool because you could change the level to 3 or 5, and it in and of itself was originally a level 4, which meant that this deck suddenly had access to level 3, 4, and 5 Exceed monsters because of the accessibility of Wind Up Shark, both searching it off Factory, special summoning from the graveyard with Rat, searching it from the deck with Magician. This deck could easily put 2 of these on the board, and then, as I just alluded to, go to whatever rank was necessary at the time, giving this deck a lot of flexibility when it wasn't just going for the hand loop. Then we had 3 copies of Wind Up Rat. This card was important in the Wind Up Hunter hand loop, but even going forward in this deck after that combo was nerfed by the ban list, Wind Up Rat was still a massive part, and it was, quite frankly, a massive part of this deck, even with the hand loop. The fact that this card is in your deck basically always gives you an incredible top deck, where one single card off the top of your deck can discard your opponent's whole hand, can generate a ton of card advantage, put a bunch of monsters on the board, because one Wind Up Rat, if it's live and you have a Wind Up in your graveyard that's level 3, can turn into a Zenmatti, and if you have yet to use your Zenmattis, one Zenmatti can very easily turn into 3 because you can search these out of your deck with each subsequent Zenmatti that you summon, suddenly putting 3 1,500 monsters on the board, and then ultimately special summoning a few monsters from your deck. So Wind Up Rat, a massive part. It was a comeback card, a combo piece, rank 3, which is what this deck's primary rank would be. And as a result, we're going to run 3 copies, as was basically the case the entirety of Wind Up's existence. And of course, I alluded to it a moment ago, but it combos perfectly with the rabbit. Next, we have 2 copies of Wind Up Magician. I've elected only to run 2, which was basically the standard during the summer because it wasn't until the fall when Wind Ups transferred into the Wind Up Magician / Shark into Shockmaster combo that we really needed all 3 because we were trying to constantly combo Magician plus Shark. Over the summer, you could combo Magician and Shark, do the hand loop and be happy, very happy. But you also could combo Wind Up Shark plus Tour Guide and do the hand loop and be really happy. You could do Wind Up Shark plus Hunter and do a smaller hand loop and still be pretty happy. So you didn't actually need to have all of the Magicians in your deck because Shark comboed enough with other pieces of your deck. And it was a pretty dead draw in the middle of the game if you didn't have anything to combo with it, and you could always search it off of Factory anyway, so only 2 copies was pretty reasonable. The next wind-up is simply 1 single copy of Hunter. You only need 1 copy to actually pull off the hand loop. I'll show you the hand loop in the middle of the video if you're not familiar with it. We'll certainly talk about that hand loop. But this is our wind-up package. 3 Rabbit, 3 Shark, 3 Rat, 2 Magician, and 1 Hunter. From that point, we have a collection of hand traps. I like the 4-1 breakdown. I'm actually typically someone that likes the 2-2 breakdown when it's talking about Effect Veil or a Maxi, but I think I actually liked the 3-1 count. This deck has Sangan in it because it's running Tour Guide, so I always like decks with 1 Sangan with Tour Guide to have at least 1 Effect Veiler because you can always search it when you need it. This deck also with the 3 Maxis included them in order to counteract, obviously, the mirror match. That's the most obvious. But by this point of the format, some of the Inzektor decks were really emphasizing cards like Inzektor Sword, which wasn't necessarily the case when that deck first released. So the effect failure plus the Maxi also gave you decent game 1 flexibility against Inzektors. Could always just Maxi and at least get 2 draws if your opponent summons Rescue Rabbit, worst case. Obviously, it's not great against Heroes. It's not great against Dark World. It actually wasn't that bad against Chaos Dragons. Chaos Dragons were pretty combo-centric by this part of the format, so you could stymie the Chaos Dragon deck a little bit. Some of these decks elected to run Gores, giving you an out when you Maxi. I personally did not like Gores in this particular deck. This deck almost always ran Wind-Up Factory. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But this deck almost always also ran Fiendish Chain, meaning this deck had a lot of continuous spell and trap cards. So I wasn't a big fan of Gores in any of these decks. So for hand traps, I'm only going to include these 4. Your opponent doesn't know you're not running Gores, so maybe that's good enough. From there, we're just going to go over the Tour Guide engine. If you watched the Dino Rabbit deck, you will be familiar with the triple Tour Guide Sangan package. Also, the Tengu Plant deck also had this package. This was the point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, basically that full year, where most of the top tier decks had this package. In this deck, it's particularly good because one Tour Guide can summon Zenmati, which can be a combo starter. Even if you don't have any other monsters, you can go Tour Guide, search Sangan, overlay into Zenmati, detach, get Wind-Up Rabbit, and now you have a floating Strike Ninja effect. If you can protect your Zenmati that turn, then you get the effect on the next turn, and you also still have this free rabbit, and at that point you can combo off. So one single Tour Guide was a massive enabler. You could go Tour Guide, get Sangan, but honestly, that's not generally as good as just going into Zenmati. I think Zenmati is just better. But that's the Tour Guide package, and then Tour Guide plus Shark is full combo, so we'll talk about that too. You might see individuals during this format run Tour Bus from the Underworld. Technically, if you ran a Tour Bus and you open Tour Guide plus Shark, you could get an extra card out of your opponent's hand, but you had to put a really bad monster in your deck in order to do that, so it wasn't super common. But that is the monster lineup. Next, the spell lineup. I liked wind-up decks that ran the full 3 factories. I think, yes, the combo is there, but a lot of the games are grind games, and being able to continually search out wind-ups is really important so that you always have a normal summon each turn that your opponent has to respond to. If the game goes long enough, eventually your opponent is going to run out of responses, and eventually you're going to stick a rat or a magician effect and then take over the game. So the full 3 factories, I think, was really important. This deck elected to run 3 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon. You are conceding a little bit to the Chaos Dragon deck. The only thing you can really stop in Chaos Dragons is if they get Future Fusion and you have this set. If they go first with Future Fusion, there's not really much you can do. You can stop the 5-headed from coming out, but honestly, if they get to resolve Future Fusion, they're probably beating you because they're sending a bunch of Chaos monsters to the grave, Chaos Dragons specifically. The 3 Mystical Space Typhoons, though, were good against basically everything. Good against everything else. Good against Wind-Up Factory. Good against the grind matches against Rabbit. Good against Inzektors to an extent. Good against Heroes, certainly cards like Skill Drain. Then we have a bunch of sort of power 1-ofs at the time. We have Monster Reborn, one of the only extenders. Some of these decks ran Instant Fusion. I didn't love Instant Fusion. It was only an extender if you kept a level 3 on the board, because you didn't really have space to put level 4 and 5 monsters in your extra deck, so it really was only a special summon level 3 card. In addition to that, I actually think the extra deck was really tight, so this is my only extender. It could partially be a starter. Yes, if you open Wind-Up Hunter plus Instant Fusion, you can combo, but I don't think that that's worth it. Just Monster Reborn for extenders. We have Mind Control. This deck, particularly with Wind-Up Shark, can go into rank 3, 4, and 5 pretty easily, so you can take your opponent's monsters and do whatever you need. We had a Pot of Avarice. Pot of Avarice was really strong in this deck because if you comboed, you'd fill your graveyard. If you had Pot of Avarice, you could refill your deck with all of the combo pieces and then actually just take your opponent's whole hand with the Wind-Up loop because you'd put the Zenmatis back into your extra deck. We had the Mass Removal, Dark Hole, and Heavy Storm, basically staples, and then 1 single copy of Book of Moon, which was basically a staple at the time. You want to bait out Logia negations, set Dolkas, bait out negations, and also often set Thunder King Ryo. That was another card that would be really important. And then it can protect you. Really important. Nationals this year, 2012, priority's gone by Nationals. Not at the beginning of the format. Long Beach, still priority. This card became incredible after priority was gone because you could activate this when your opponent summoned Rescue Rabbit. You could activate this when your opponent summoned Zenmati, and you could make it so that their effect would no longer go through, as would be prior with priority. This deck, the trap lineups varied a little bit. I like this trap lineup. It's a pretty standard one of triple Fiendish Chain. I was never a huge fan of Fiendish Chain, but a lot of people in this format ran Fiendish Chain. It is pretty good. I will admit it is pretty good. I always just ended up cutting it in some of my decks, but it wasn't that bad. Particularly with this deck where all you're trying to do is survive to pull off the combo, and once you pull off the combo, it doesn't really matter if your opponent had a monster on the board because you just discarded their whole hand and took advantage. This card's really good at doing everything from shutting down a Thunder King to keeping you alive. Obviously, it's great against decks like Inzectors. You want as much reactionary cards when your opponent summons an Inzector monster as possible. We had double Torrential, double Solemn Warning, and then a single Solemn Judgment. This is a pretty typical trap lineup for this deck. One change you might make is cutting a Fiendish Chain for a Mirror Force, but I hated Mirror Force against Inzectors. It was a completely dead card. They would never attack into you. They would just pop all of your cards and then OTK you, so Mirror Force wasn't particularly good. I guess having that third Fiendish Chain was, at least in that context, a little bit better. But that is the main deck. It's a 40-card main deck. I will talk first about the extra deck, and then I'll talk about the Wind-Up Hunter combo, and then we'll talk about the decks at the time and the side deck. So this was when we could run 3 copies of Wind-Up Zenmati. This card would be limited to 1 and then eventually banned, where it is still currently on the ban list at the filming of this video. Zenmati was incredible. Obviously, it's special summon to wind up from your deck. You're running a wind-up deck, so you can take a lot of advantage of that. Comboing with Rat and Hunter, you could take your opponent's whole hand, or at least a large percentage of your opponent's hand. We'll talk about that. It also had a second effect where if a wind-up was destroyed outside of the battle phase, outside of specifically damage step rather, you could detach to bounce it back to your hand, which was actually pretty powerful. If this card just sort of hung out on the field and your opponent played something like a Smashing Ground, you could actually bounce back a wind-up to your hand and continue to generate card advantage that way. Didn't happen all the time, but it did happen occasionally. You know, for example, this could be sitting out on the field. Maybe your opponent just used a Dolka effect on a monster that was on the board, got destroyed and sent to the graveyard, and now you're using your Wind-Up Zenmati to bounce it back to your hand. So as long as it's not damage step, you can detach 1 Exceed material from this card to target that monster and return it to your hand. So in addition to special summoning from the deck, it had a little bit of other utility too. The next card, and I'm going to word this as, these are the necessities. This extra deck is very debatable, and I'll talk about some of that debate as we go. You need at least 1 Leviathan Dragon. A lot of people, particularly the Europeans, liked to run multiple copies of Leviathan Dragon. I think it was probably better to run 1 Leviathan Dragon and 1 Giga Brilliant. This deck summons rank 3s a lot, so that's why we're going to have a lot of them. I like having 1 of each because you don't always necessarily want to go into the second Leviathan Dragon. There might actually be times where you want to boost your entire board, which is what Giga Brilliant can do. There's 1 Leviair. Leviair was critical. It was a combo piece. When you banished a Wind-Up Rabbit effect, used the Wind-Up Rabbit effect, banishing anything from a Magician to a Rat, you could get it back instantly by going into Leviair, so that was really important. Not that you needed Zen mains because it was a wind-up. This could be called Evolzar Zen mains and you'd still probably play it. It was that powerful. But Zen mains was another wind-up, and it was in and of itself a really powerful card. You could stall out, you could crash, get rid of annoying cards like Floodgates. Technically, you could trigger wind-up factories with it, so it did have some flexibility there. That was a necessity. I personally think Temtempo is a necessity. If you play this format, you'll notice how often you want to go into Temtempo. It was a really great card against Zen mains, really great card against Acid Golem. Acid Golem obviously has a really bad effect when it has no materials. Temtempo can force out the Exceed detaches. It was, all in all, a pretty good card. You could get it up to 27 pretty easily. Also really good against Utopia. You could take off their materials and then attack into it, and it has to destroy itself. So Temtempo, a really powerful card. I think it was a necessity. I don't think that one was much debatable. I think you needed a quantity of these rank 5s. Now, the only way you're going into these is with Wind-Up Shark, but it happens a lot. You have 2 sharks on the board, basically whenever you want by the middle to late game. I liked, at bare minimum, Zenmayo and Tiras. I could understand why you wouldn't put Adrius in there. I don't think it's the worst one, but if you can go into a rank 5, you can go into a rank 3, and if there's a problem face up, you theoretically have the ability to crash and destroy it with Zen mains as opposed to going into Adrius. As a result, I think these 2 are the necessity. This one's going to be, I'm going to call a flex spot, but we'll put these 2 here up in what I consider the necessities. You might consider this a necessity. I totally understand, but I think that one's a little bit debatable. From that point, if you're going to side deck Cyber Dragon, this was a necessity. Cyber Dragon is actually pretty good in the mirror match because if your opponent made a big board, they almost always ended with machine monsters, specifically Zenmati and Zen mains, and you could special summon your Cyber Dragon and clear out their machine monsters. So if you're going to side deck Cyber Dragon, honestly, one of the main reasons for doing so was to go into Chimera Tech. So I'm going to put that as a necessity because the side deck I'm going to show you will have Cyber Dragon. But if you don't run Cyber Dragon, obviously it's not a necessity. All right, next are definitely the debatable ones. So we have three 5, 7, 9, 11 necessities. From there, we need to fill out 4 more, whether that's Adrius or any of these. The first 2 are Utopia and Utopia Ray. I think they were useful, particularly because you're running Mind Control as well. You can Mind Control your opponent's Utopia and just overlay into Utopia Ray. So it's like a free destruction of one of your opponent's monsters that they invest 2 monsters in. You can obviously steal games with this. You can go into rank 4s because of your access to Shark. And you needed some rank 4. So whether you're running Utopia or Roach or Maestro, you did need some rank 4s so that the Sharks had that flexibility. Otherwise, you're not running any. So you need to pick some number of these. I can understand not including this because it was only really good against Heretics and Chaos Dragons, and I think you can actually beat those decks without this card. I understand not running Maestro. It is in and of itself not 100% a necessity, but I do like Maestro. And the last card that's debatable is Gaia Dragon. Yes, you do have some rank 5s. I could imagine a scenario where you want the piercing, but at that point you need to make a decision. So you can run 4 cards in this bottom row. Pick the 4 that you think are the most important. It varies per person. To me, I would probably put the Utopias in my deck. I like Utopia. I like that flexibility with Mind Control. I think I like Maestro. And from there, I can be swayed with either of these final 3. But these, I think, are the necessities. But this was debatable. This was a debatable extra deck, which is good. I actually like formats where maybe the first 10 cards are absolute guarantees, but then each individual player needs to decide what they value for the last few, and this was easily one of those decks. Before I talk about the side deck and decks at the time, I need to talk a little bit about the wind-up loop, just because if you're not familiar with this deck at this time, you might not know what I'm talking about. Like, what do you mean this wind-up loop? All right, we're going to talk about sort of the basic wind-up hunter loops. I commented on the wind-up hunter loop several times in the deck profile. There were a lot of different ways of pulling this off, but I'm going to go through the Tour Guide Magician, rather the Tour Guide Shark and the Shark Magician combo. So again, you can see the Shark is an important pivotal part in both of them. Let's start first with Tour Guide and Shark. So you open both of these cards and your opponent has no response. So no Maxi, no Effect Veiler, no DD Crow, nothing like that. Well, what can you do? Well, you summon the Tour Guide and you search your deck for Sangan. That is correct. You search your deck for Sangan. You wouldn't want to search your deck for a second Tour Guide here, because in doing so, you would leave yourself with the last Tour Guide and a Sangan in your deck, and 50% of the cards you could draw in that situation are not great. You don't really want to draw Sangan with a dead Tour Guide in your deck, because later the Tour Guide itself is dead. You actually do search Sangan, so they're double Tour Guide in your deck, because now they're both really good draws. Theoretically, you could search Torbus. That would actually hit an extra card out of your opponent's hand. Generally speaking, people didn't actually run Torbus, so they would just go and get Sangan. Here they would overlay into Zenmati. Now, the mistake that you might make if you go back and play this format is trying to special summon Shark right now. That's actually not the correct time to do it. What you'd want to do first is detach off the Zenmati and go into Wind-Up Magician. Now, with the special summon of this Wind-Up, you want to reveal the Shark in your hand, triggering the Magician's effect, allowing you to summon from your deck a second Magician. I'm putting it in attack mode just to illustrate that I've yet to use its effect. When Magician uses its effect, it summons the Wind-Up in defense. But again, just for the sake of clarification that we know this current Magician has yet to use its effect, I'm going to put it in attack. But it's going to shift it really quick. This Shark is now going to go to level 3 using its effect. And now that's going to enable the second Magician to use its effect. And now I can summon another Wind-Up from my deck. This is where I'm going to search for Wind-Up Hunter. So now my board is Zenmati, Magician, Magician, Wind-Up Shark, and Wind-Up Hunter. This point, I can use the Wind-Up Hunter's effect to send the Magician to the graveyard, and now I've discarded or sent the first card in my opponent's hand to the graveyard. Dark World is actually a deck at this point, so the fact that it's sent mattered. I'll use this die to represent the quantity of cards my opponent has sent from their hand to the graveyard randomly. Now I have 2 level 3s on the board, and I can go into my second copy of Wind-Up Zenmati, and I can detach, and it's really important here to actually detach the Hunter. We needed to go to the graveyard, so we'll detach the Hunter. And we'll search our deck for a copy of Wind-Up Rat. Rat special summons in attack mode, and it can be activating its effect to shift to defense to bring back the Hunter from our graveyard. We then can send the Magician to the graveyard using its effect, and that will enable us to send a second card from our opponent's hand to the graveyard. Now we can overlay again into our final copy of Zenmati and use its effect to detach the Hunter and summon another Rat from our deck. That Rat will then shift to defense, bringing out the Hunter. And here, you will use the Hunter's effect to detach, or rather the Hunter's effect to discard the final card, the third card out of our opponent's hand. Now, your opponent's going to start with 5, which means they're going to actually start with 2. You then have the option here of going into a rank 3 to end this combo. You can go into Zen Mains, you can go into Leviathan, you can go into Giga Brilliant. Typically, Zen Mains is probably the best. But what's especially potent here is you've just used 2 cards. You actually still have 4 cards in your hand. Remember, this is a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where you draw 6 going first. And your opponent has to deal with Zen Mains and 2 live Zen Maddies. And they only have 3 cards in their hand because you sent 3 to start, and then they'll get to draw their 6th and start with just 3 cards. If they don't deal with both Zen Maddies, you actually left a rat in your deck, so you'll be able to special summon by detaching on the following turn the last rat from your deck and go into a rank 3. You also can just, let's say for the sake of argument, rat is in your hand. Well, that's fine. I can go and search out rabbits and I can start making that game plan. You only really need 1 shark to pull this off, and if both of these stay on the board, you also could just detach both of them on the following turn and summon 2 sharks, which means you can go into rank 3, 4, or 5s with them. So this was a particularly potent combo because it left 2 Zen Maddies on the board and a Zen Mains that your opponent had to deal with. Now, there are other iterations of that. Let's go back a little bit. It's the same combo of cards, but let's say you know you're running, or you know you're playing against a deck like Chaos Dragons or a deck like Rabbit. There are actually different sequences that you can take. So we'll start with Tour Guide, get Sangin again. That's always better than Tour Guide, get Tour Guide. We're going to go into our first Zen Maddie. The common mistake here is to summon a shark. If you have never played this format, you might try and do that here, but that's not the time you want to do it. You want to detach and search Magician so that when you special summon the shark here, it triggers the Magician's effect, hits the board, and the Magician resolves by special summoning from the deck of Magician. Now you can reduce the shark to level 3, which is going to be necessary, triggering the last Magician and getting Hunter onto the board. So it's actually the same point right now of the combo. But now we're actually going to overlay into a rank 4. You may have been curious, why were you sending Magicians that whole time? Can't you just make a rank 4? Well, the answer to that is yes. There are 2 rank 4s worth going into in this format if you know what your opponent's running. If they're running Rabbit, Utopia is actually pretty good. That 2,500 threshold is really annoying for the Rabbit player. Lagia doesn't do anything to it. Dolk is not really the greatest thing in the world because you can just attack over it. So Utopia is really good. But I talked about how Roach might not be the greatest card in the world in the extra deck, but if you know you're running Roach and you're playing against Chaos Dragons, you can go into that here either. So I'm going to put these both on top of each other. Obviously, you'd only go into one. You decide to go into one of these. Now here, we can use the Hunter effect and detach, or rather to discard 1 card out of our opponent's hand by sending the Zen Maddie. You can probably guess where we're going to go here. It's a pretty typical wind-up combo from this point. We go Zen Maddie, we search the rat. Rat brings back the Hunter. Hunter discards a card out of our opponent's hand. That's now 2. I use these to go into another Zen Maddie. I make sure I send the Hunter. I get another rat from the deck. Rat brings back Hunter. Hunter sends this to the grave. That's the furthest that we can go, which is 3 cards. But then now you can end with a few different things. You can end here with Zen Mains. That's not the worst thing in the world. So you have Zen Mains plus a rank 4. That's a pretty reasonable combination of cards. You could also, to go back a little bit, at this point, I just sent a Zen Maddie to the graveyard for Hunter's effect. I could actually just send the rat if I wanted. And if I did choose to go into Utopia instead, I could end with a kind of useless Hunter, but I could end with a Zen Maddie threatening its effect on the following turn. I just discarded or sent 3 cards from my opponent's hand to the graveyard, and now I actually have the Utopia on the board, threatening to negate any attacks. So this is actually a pretty reasonable sequence too. Ending with Utopia, having a useless Hunter on the board, but then having Zen Maddie, and I can just use Hunter on the next turn. It's not the end of the world. So there are a few different things that you can do if you open up with Tour Guide with Shark. Zen Maddie, Zen Mains, and sometimes Roach. The final combo is when you open up with Shark and Magician. This has always been sort of a classic combo with windups, even after the limitation of Zen Maddie. But you normal summon the Magician and you reveal the Shark, triggering the Magician's effect, special summoning another Magician from your deck in defense mode. The Shark hits the board, and now you will reduce the Shark to level 3, allowing you to activate the other Magician's effect, which summons a Hunter from the deck. From this point, you would then use your wind-up Hunter to send the Magician. Now, both Magicians have used their effects, so it doesn't really matter which one you send. You've sent 1 card from your opponent's hand to the graveyard, and you can probably guess where this is going. It's sort of the exact same iteration that we just talked about, where Rat comes out, brings back a Hunter. Now you can send the Magician here to the graveyard. We want the Zen Maddie to float here, so we're going to send the Magician. We're going to overlay into Zen Maddie, send it. We just discarded a 2nd card during that last iteration. Rat comes out, Rat brings back the Hunter. Hunter now uses its effect to send the Zen Maddie to the graveyard. That's 3 cards. We now overlay into the last copy of Zen Maddie. It's going to detach, Hunter to bring out another copy of Rat. Rat is then going to activate its effect to bring out the Hunter, sending to the graveyard one final time a Zenmati. We'll do the one that I put in attack mode. Sending a 4th card and then overlaying here into a rank 3. Presumably, Zenmanes is probably the best. Your opponent now needs to deal with Zenmanes, but then also a Zenmati that's floating. And you're threatening to special summon a wind-up from your deck during the following turn, like Rabbit or a Shark, which can obviously be very threatening. And your opponent, again, only has 2 cards to work with because we sent 4 of their first 5. And then obviously they get that new, fresh 6th card. Maybe hopefully they'll just draw a dead hand trap now that you've actually done your whole combo. That was always the worst feeling, when your 6th card was a hand trap and you have to sit there with one of the cards you opened with plus a dead hand trap. But that's pretty common Magician Shark combo. Obviously, there are lots of different pathways. I could sit here for an hour doing combos, but these are sort of the basic 3 combos of getting the hand loop and establishing a pretty reasonable board at the end. In terms of what you might anticipate running, or playing against rather, if you were to go to the 2012 Nationals and go back to play this format, you could run into Hero Beats. That was not the best deck in the world, but it was definitely a deck. Hero Beat, Bubble Beat, depending on which variation you're looking at. Decks based on Gemini Spark, Hero Blast, Skill Drain, and Elemental Heroes. You could obviously run into Inzectors, might even be the most popular deck, quite frankly. A lot of people ran Inzectors. At this point, a pretty combo-centric version with Sword. You could run into Chaos Dragons. Chaos Dragons were pretty popular in the middle stages of the format. Plenty of them topped. Jarrell Winston went to Worlds using a Chaos Dragon deck at this National, so we have Chaos Dragons. I played Dark World round 1 of this Nationals, so Dark World was still a playable deck. It won, obviously, the Long Beach YCS earlier in the format. We have the deck that I ran, of course, Rescue Rabbit, the Dino Rabbit variant. By this point, a lot of people were main decking Macrocosmos. That's what I was doing for most of the format. A lot of people ran that variation with main deck Macrocosmos. But you didn't necessarily have to. Plenty of people didn't main Macrocosmos and did plenty well without it. So Rabbit either with or without Macrocosmos. Obviously, you can run into the mirror match. That deck won National, so of course you're going to run into some mirror matches. And then I didn't include this when I talked about Rabbit, but I'm going to include it now because at Nationals specifically, I was worried about Final Countdown decks. A Final Countdown deck at the hands of Tyler Tabin, who actually won the 2012 Nationals later on with windups, ran a Final Countdown deck at the YCS in Philadelphia, which was the event prior to Nationals. As a result, I think you definitely needed to consider the possibility of running into a Final Countdown deck that's using triple One Day of Peace, Threatening Wars, Wabakus, and a bunch of other battle phase stoppers to make it so that the Final Countdown goes off after 20 turns or at least 10 full opponent turns. So these were the main decks at the time. I'll run through a pretty typical side deck. So this format, there was a lot of variation in people's side decks. I looked at a bunch of old deck lists from the US Nationals, from some of the European events, some of the recent YCSs relative to the time period. This is what I think is a pretty typical wind-up side deck. This is what I settled on. I like DD Crow. It's good against wind-up Hornet. It's also good against Grapha, so it has some flexibility there. So double DD Crow. It's also good because if you were to DD Crow Hunter in the mirror match, you could stop your opponent's hand loop. And you yourself might actually be able to exploit that. And if your opponent invests their normal summons on turn 1 by using Tour Guide already, you might be able to follow up with your Tour Guide and steal their Hunter. And then you might be able to do a combo with that. Depends on the makeup of your hand, but there is some flexibility there. DD Crowing stuff out of your opponent's graveyard and then summoning it with Leviair in the mirror match. Double Snowman Eater. A lot of the decks in this format sided the Snowman Eaters. This card was so good against Heroes. I cannot begin to tell you how frustrating it was games 2 and 3 to have to play around stupid Snowman Eater. All your monsters are either 1900 or lower, other than the Shining. And when your opponent sets a monster, you always have to respect Snowman Eater, so you end up Gemini Sparking face downs, and they could be Sangin. It really was a tough card to deal with. Cyber Dragon was surprisingly good in the mirror match. If you are going to end with any amount of cards in your hand after your opponent takes a bunch of them, Cyber Dragon would be high on the list, because if your opponent left a Zenmayo on the board or a Zenmanes, any of the machines, not Zenmayo, Zenmati or Zenmanes, you could special summon Cyber Dragon and then go into Chimera Tech. So there's a pretty reasonable card there. It's also a good card against Heroes and maybe to a lesser extent Dino Rabbit, but some of the grind decks, the 2100 special summon could be useful. It's also a level 5. That should be noted that you can summon Shark with this and go into a rank 5. Your rank 5s are pretty dang powerful, so definitely something to consider with Cyber Dragon. A couple spells. You could either have sided Soul Takers or Smashing Grounds. I think Soul Taker was better. That was pretty clear to a lot of players by the middle of this format. You could Soul Taker a Light Pulsar Dragon and it would miss timing. You could also Soul Taker the Shining, the elements of Hero the Shining, and it would miss timing. This card was good at baiting out Lagia or Dolka negations, totally killing Dolka, obviously, baiting out Lagia negations, good baiting out aliases so they can't Gemini Spark you. So Soul Taker did a lot. It also good at taking down Thunder King Raios, which could be a little bit of a problem. From there, we had a couple copies of Dimensional Prison. I see a lot of players either siding Deep Prisons or Bottomless Trap Holes, which I think is reasonable. Game 2 and 3 tend to be a lot grindier than Game 1. Game 1, you might be all about the combo. Game 2 and 3, you might be siding out some combo pieces, anticipating more Thunder Kings and a little bit have a harder match. Dimensional Prison does a good job taking care of Thunder Kings. It does a good job taking care of aliases and some of the cards in the more grindy decks like Rabbit and Hero. So double Deep Prison, double Royal Decree. I think this was a good inclusion, as I alluded to a few moments ago. We have to actually not worry about Final Countdown. Royal Decree was also really good against Heroes. I can tell you that from personal experience. My first loss at YCS Long Beach earlier in that year in March of 2012. With my Hero deck, my opponent loops me with Windups game 1, Magician Shark, turn 1, game 1. I scoop so they don't know what deck I'm running. Game 2, I have a pretty reasonable start with a lot of traps though. They go, set Decree, pass. I don't destroy their Decree. I don't have a way of doing so. He flips Decree end phase, and then Windup loops me again, and I end up getting my first loss. Decree was really good against decks like Heroes if you don't have access to, obviously, Gemini Spark. So Decree, fantastic card. Also really good against the Final Countdown deck. From there, I have 2 copies of Shadow Imprisoning Mirror. I like Shadow Imprisoning Mirror when you need to run it because it was good against Dark Worlds. Not overwhelmingly popular, but good. It was also incredible against Inzektor. It was basically a one-sided skill drain, so an incredible card against that deck. And then I think Mirror Force was reasonable. I see a lot of people citing a single copy of Mirror Force. That card could be a lot of other things. You could put a second Effect Veiler if you're afraid of combo. You could put a card like Dust Tornado if you want to have more outs to wind up Factory. So the Mirror Force isn't necessary, but I looked at some top deck lists from the European Nats, the US Nats, and put together what I think is a representative side deck for a wind-up deck at this time. But nevertheless, that's Joe Giorlando looking at wind-ups from the summer of 2012. I don't have any individual person particular list here. It was more of a generic list, but there were plenty of wind-up decks, some that ran Instant Fusion, a little bit more combo-centric, some that were a little bit more controlling. But really a top deck during 2012 obviously won the US Nationals at the hands of Tyler Tapman. Thank you for watching. Check back soon. I'll talk in the near future about some of the other decks during this format. Heroes is on the list. I've been asked about that a lot. Inzektors is on the list. Dark World I can absolutely talk about too. Maybe not Final Countdown, but some of the other decks here I will absolutely talk about in the near future. So check back soon for that.